Welcome everybody. Hello, it's nice to see you all. A horrible day out there. It's probably better doing it this way than marching along the road in the rain. Welcome everybody. I'm Nigel Day from Oxford CND. What we do, Oxford CND, Abingdon Peace Group, Farringdon Peace Group and Kiddington Peace Group with other friends in our area, campaign as the Oxfordshire Peace Campaign at the US base at Croughton. This major US communications intelligence base supports space communications, data links, military drone information, bomber guidance, missile defense, diplomatic communications, and command and control warfighting functions. So it's a key link in the chain controlling US surveillance, armed drone, and special force operations across Africa and the Middle East, a very important place that quietly sits beside the road. So this webinar marks the beginning of Keep Space for Peace Week. And we will discuss the role of RAF Croughton, and we call it USAF Croughton, as well as much wider strategic issues. There are guest speakers to follow. The first one will be Paul Mobbs, who is not talking live, but we'll be showing a video from him, 10 to 14 minutes, followed by Dave Webb, who's the chair of CND, and then followed by Kate Hudson, who's the CND General Secretary. All very experienced activists, academics, wonderful people. You're going to enjoy this. Then there'll be a Q&A session afterwards, and it will follow. That will be ending with a webinar and with a slideshow and singing 4 peace songs to end this wonderful webinar. Thank you very much. Let's have the first speaker. This is Paul Mobbs, who is a man who is very experienced about this base and runs a group called Croughtonwatch. So this is his video. Thank you.
Government always abides by the rule of law.
The rule of law.
The rule of law. This government will always respect the rule of law.
The Secretary of State has said that he is committed, and the government are committed to the rule of law. Does he recognise that the adherence to the rule of law is not negotiable?
I would say to my honourable friend that yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept of direct effect required by Article 4 in a certain very tightly defined circumstances.
Recently, the media have been complaining that the British government intends to break international law as part of Brexit. In practice, these complaints highlight the media's historic silence when the British government has routinely broken international law before, in particular, our involvement in foreign conflicts enforcing US and Western interests. Another opportunity to explore how the British government facilitates international law breaking was the killing of Harry Dunn outside USAF Croughton. Why do American personnel at this site have diplomatic immunity? The detailed answer to that question raises many uncomfortable facts, such as the fact that far worse acts than dangerous driving regularly take place at US foreign bases in Japan or South Korea, or the fact that USAF Croughton has for many years been routinely involved in the killing of civilians on a daily basis. Why do the civilian staff of this base have diplomatic immunity? Why has the British government exempted this site from international humanitarian law to facilitate its abuse of civilians in far-flung places around the world? This is not an RAF base, and we should not use that designation. The British government and the RAF officially have no knowledge of what goes on here, especially in relation to this site's involvement in drone warfare and targeted killing. The day-to-day work of USAF Croughton is to support the abuse of human rights as part of US foreign policy. The American government sets the rules here. They run and police the site, and American exceptionalism over international humanitarian law has official leave to operate within its perimeter fence. USAF Croughton's role is to act as a communications hub for military and intelligence sites across Britain and Europe. It is a global link in the command and control chain of the American military's network-centric warfare system. By connecting all military sites and hardware to a single network, many different operations can be managed by military and intelligence staff anywhere across the world.
Engine start.
As the sharp end of military operations now routinely involves the use of armed drones, network-centric warfare is designed to allow a few people to run a global, covert, low-intensity, lethal military campaign using few personnel or resources. Once the communications hardware is in place, it can be used to carry out unlawful acts at any time, with little control or oversight by the nation hosting that installation. The German government recently sought to restrict the use of American bases for drone warfare, as required by international law. Our government will not even acknowledge that such operations are supported from here. From the outside, what is most easily seen are the radomes, the large grey balls housing satellite dishes. Though highly visible, they are not the largest part of the site's communications capacity. Croughton is part of a global system of fibre optic cables that spans the globe, shifting data, telemetry and voice communications from the continental USA to Europe and then on to the Middle East and North Africa. From the hill opposite the base you get a view down onto the site. Near the centre is a large tower. This connects to the nearby USAF Barford St John, which operates shortwave radio equipment and possibly connects to yet more national data trunks. At the foot of the tower is a group of low buildings. These form the communications centre, managing the flow of data in and out of the site and hosting the racks of computer servers required to run that. More significant though is the large windowless building to the east, protected within its high security enclosure. This is the operations centre where US military and intelligence staff run the operations of the site and help support foreign missions. That could be anything from running CIA surveillance on Chancellor Merkel's mobile phone, to JSOC launching drone strikes in North Africa, to US Cyber Command hacking computer networks. One of the more significant cables that runs from Croughton links directly to the US military's Camp Le Monnier in Djibouti. This is a site from which US forces launch drone strikes in Yemen and across North Africa, and which coordinates the many small lily pad bases across the Sahara region that undertake counter-terrorism operations.
The chorus of opposition to U.S. drone attacks is getting louder and louder in Yemen. The Yemeni parliament has banned drone attacks in a symbolic vote. Anger has been on the rise at the U.S. drone attacks in Yemen. The country has seen several protests against deadly raids by the unmanned aerial vehicles. Washington has stepped up its drone operations in Yemen in recent months. The attacks have killed many people. The U.S. says it's targeting al-Qaeda-linked militants, but many Yemenis call this a violation of their sovereignty. The American drone strikes have killed large numbers of people in other Muslim countries, including Pakistan. The United Nations has condemned the U.S. for using its drones for what the world body calls targeted killings.
To date, the operations run from Camp Le Monnier and its lily pad sites have routinely broken international humanitarian law and the laws of war. Camp Le Monnier also has a significant involvement supporting Saudi-led forces bombing Yemen, just across the Red Sea from Djibouti, in the process creating one of the world's worst humanitarian crises today.
The war that began in 2015 has killed tens of thousands of people and created the world's most urgent humanitarian emergency. But there's another war being waged in Yemen, overshadowed by the strife in the country. The US has been conducting drone strikes in Yemen for the last 16 years. There were 127 strikes in 2017 alone. The so-called signature strikes have aimed to suppress members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But the campaign has killed scores of civilians, targeting houses, schools, hospitals, markets, and even wedding processions. In an examination of drone strikes this year, the AP and Bureau of Investigative Journalism found that at least 30 of those killed were not Al-Qaeda members. That's around a third of people killed in drone strikes so far this year. The US started its drone warfare in Yemen in 2002, and it has drawn widespread criticism for hitting targets and regions, without a proven source associating them with militants. As many as 1,700 people have been killed, and thousands have been wounded since the first reported strike. But the drone deaths have fallen off the radar since the US-backed Saudi-led military coalition started its bombing raids against the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. There are no reports of the precise number of civilian deaths, due to the difficulty in confirming the identities of those killed. And the US government does not provide adequate explanations detailing their strikes. This has led to the international community raising concerns about the lack of enforcement of humanitarian laws that call for the safety of civilians.
As the site is instrumental in supporting those operations, the staff at USAF Croughton are complicit in those acts too. This is British territory. It is not part of the American sovereign state. British law technically applies to all operations here, but by exempting USAF Croughton from those laws, our own government, and by extension, all of us, are complicit in those actions too. The problem of exceptionalism and the political expediency of breaking international law to suit national ambition is that it can become infectious. Under Donald Trump, it has become official US foreign policy. With Brexit, that same approach is now seemingly applicable here too. As part of a less publicised Overseas Operations Bill, Britain is proposing to exempt our armed forces from the UN Convention Against Torture and the European Convention on Human Rights. Thing is, once we roll back historic protections on killing or torture, what international standards are not open to willing abuse? Not just abroad, but at home too. USAF Croughton is symbolic of the West's exceptionalism in the application of international law. More directly, it is symbolic of the West's willingness to accept killing, maiming, and mass suffering of civilians in order to guarantee their own national advantage in global affairs. As our government engages in ever more flagrant breaches of international rules, we have a duty to oppose and, if possible, halt these operations. Croughtonwatch exists to support those willing to assist in countering the activities of USAF Croughton. For more information on the site and its activities, see our website.
That's a very good update on what happens at USAF Croughton. I'd like to develop that by introducing the next speaker, who's Dave Webb. He is the chair of CND, and he's also the convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. So this would be a wonderful chance to hear his views on this. Thank you.
Dave, are you still with us?
Yeah. Right, would you like to develop that, Dave? We've heard what's happening at Croughton. Would you like to introduce your talk and carry on?
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There seems to be a message coming up on my computer that says my network is unstable. Or my connection is unstable. I think it's matching the rest of the world, really. But let's hope it's sort of stable enough to keep going. I would like to show some slides. So I'm going to try to do that now. Share the screen. Can you see those? You can't see that. Okay, hang on. Sorry. Try again. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, now coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to go through one at a time. So, yes, thank you very much. This is a really important time this week. As Nigel mentioned, I'm involved in CND, but also the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, which is an organization which has been going since 1992 and has, as a response to the growing militarization of space and the fact that nuclear materials were being sent up into space to power spacecraft, and those nuclear materials could easily have come back on Earth or been blown up on launch and spread plutonium, because that's what they consist of, all over the planet. So since 1999, the United Nations have declared this first week in October as being World Space Week, to celebrate the contributions of space science and technology to the betterment of the human condition. And the Global Network has called for global actions during that week over the last number of years to draw attention to what's happening with the militarization of space. And over the years, we've produced a number of different posters. You can see here, this is the current one here on the bottom right. And last year, we were able to coordinate 40 actions, at least 40 actions in 10 different countries around the world at different places, which usually were bases associated with militarization of space or corporations that are involved in that same project. And this year, of course, we're not able to do the same thing. So a series of webinars are appearing on the internet. So the main concern here is the misuse of outer space. And in particular, we're worried about the militarization of space. The US Space Command, which has been saying since 2000 really, that it wants to dominate the space dimension of military operations, this is their words, to protect US interests and investment, integrating space forces into warfighting capabilities across the full spectrum of conflict. And one of their original kind of documents that drew attention to this was the Vision for 2020, the so-called Vision for 2020, which appeared in 1997. And it describes the goal of US full spectrum dominance, military superiority on land, at sea, in the air, in space, and of information as well, which is important inclusion. And so now we know the Earth is surrounded by hundreds of satellites, and drone operations, missile defense systems. Did you lose me again there?
Sorry, Dave. Yeah, we just lost you in your
Short time.
Don't know where you lost me, but I'll carry on, shall I?
But missile defense, you started to talk about that, and that's where you lost.
Okay. And have you got? You still got the screen that I'm sharing?
No, you're going to need to share that.
Share it again. I've shared the wrong one. Sorry. Okay. So if we just go through some of those networks of satellite functions, just to give you an idea of how global this whole system is. And remember, this is really run for and by the US military. So ground-based stations around the world are used to track satellites and space objects, usually satellites of other nations and space debris, which can be dangerous to satellites. So included in that network of ground-based stations is Fylingdales up here in North Yorkshire, which is a huge radar system. There's another radar in northern Norway, signified as Globus 2 here, which was originally stationed in the US and shipped over to Norway. There's also some all over, as you can see from this map, but Hawaii has optical telescopes to view satellites, very powerful optical telescopes. And there's also an observing station in Diego Garcia, which is a whole subject in its own right, but many of you will know it's basically atoll which was stolen by the British and then handed over to America to use, not American military to use it for purposes. So next on the list is information, hacking, interception for other stations around the world, including Pine Gap, right in the center of Australia here, from Japan, from New Zealand, from Menwith Hill, again in North Yorkshire, Mornstow, down in Cornwall, Bude, in Cornwall, in Norway, and all this. And the next activities which are going on all over the place by everybody, but in particular by the US, by China, and by Russia. Then we have satellite communication networks, which enable the command and control of everything everywhere at any time, and that includes Croughton. Croughton's involved in a number of these different operations which we've been through already, but these kind of communication systems that are set up enable command and control of everything, all even down to the solitary military soldier, US Army soldier with the receiving equipment, but it can control battle management anywhere on the globe. And some of that information is transmitted through Croughton, as is some of the intelligence gathering information. Now, Croughton was going to be extended into a much larger intelligence operations center, but then I think it's now been really shifted over to Molesworth. Molesworth was due to close in a few years' time, but instead it's being enlarged and it's going to become a joint operations intelligence center for analyzing all the information, all of this data that's being brought in for the military. Also missile defense systems, which would deny retaliation and enable a first nuclear strike. This means that they have different space components of that missile defense system, and those space components have to relay information down to Earth, down to ground-based stations. And one of those ground-based stations that's planned is Menwith Hill, again in North Yorkshire. Well, of course, drones. We've had some information on the drones already. They're used for surveillance, but also they can be piloted remotely to spy on various regions of the world, and to also to deliver death through these missiles that it can fire thousands of miles away. Other types of space object which are under development really are hypersonic intercontinental cruise missiles and so-called scramjets, which are being developed for what the US calls prompt global strike. That is enabling it to hit anywhere on Earth with a military strike within 30 or 40 minutes. And this is one of the things that these hypersonic, that is many times the speed of sound missiles which are being developed, not only by the US, but also by Russia and China and others too. There are also secret unmanned space planes which are being developed and already being flown on a number of missions, some lasting several months or even over a year. And further developments are also underway. Ideas for so-called rods from God, firing projectiles down onto the Earth from space, multiple satellite operations, lasers from space, and space planes and so on. All kinds of projects are now underway, or at least being considered by the Trump administration. And of course, December last year, Donald Trump authorized the US Space Force. And as part of that as part of that launch, he said there's going to be a lot of things happening in space, because space is the world's newest war-fighting domain. And also Mark Esper, the US Secretary of Defense, was quoted as saying, maintaining American dominance in that domain is now the mission of the United States Space Force. And not only is America developing space forces, but Britain has a space force too, as does France and India. China and Russia have been major operators in space for a number of years now, military space. South Korea is considering a space force. So the whole idea of the militarization of space is escalating at an enormous rate. And we have to be very wary of all of this. The French Minister of Defense, Florence Parly, on the left there, discussed the new French Space Force in a speech in Verdun in July last year. Next to her there is the French Air Force General Philippe Lavigne. And in terms of Britain, Penny Mordaunt, who was the UK Defence Secretary in July 2009, when the British Space Force was launched, said, today we show the sky is no longer the limit for our armed forces, and that Joint Forces Command will become Strategic Command. Joint Forces Command will coordinate the war-fighting domains of air, land, sea, cyber, and space. So these are echoing the words of the United States Space Command. The UK will also be first partner to join Operation Olympic Defender, which is a US-led international coalition aimed at deterring so-called hostile actions by rivals. And also there's a group, this team of scientists, engineers, strategists will form something called Artemis, and a memorandum of understanding between the Surrey Satellite Technology Limited Group, SSTL, and the RAF team called Artemis was signed in July 2019. The idea of this is to produce a whole constellation of small satellites to carry out Ministry of Defence work. So for the RAF, they will act as a data link to relay to fighter jets, giving them a complete picture for pilot tactical awareness, what's called spatial awareness. In other words, to feed in all the kind of information about the environment where they are to help them with their particular missions. So the big question is, how can we keep space for peace? And there are different ways in which this could be achieved through the agreement of treaties in the UN. So we're starting from down here with space cooperation. We already have an outer space treaty, which was signed many years ago, and in fact initiated by the US, Russia and the UK. And there are all these kind of paths forward towards security in outer space without militarization. Unfortunately, those steps are stymied all the time by the United States. The United States has been stalling any progress that's been attempted in the UN. And so there's an incredible amount of frustration that's been grown, in the same way as a lot of frustration has grown up through the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. The same problem exists with militarization of space. Develop and force government to change their particular view on space. We are working on the global network is distance down in Oxford to bring lots of people this week for the last few years, and we've got to keep up that pressure, keep up showing the American bases that they are no longer really welcome here. They're welcome as people, but not as military bases. So this we have a poster which is developed, you can get from the Global Network website, Space for Peace. Also, the booklet is being produced for Keep Space for Peace Week. Just outline some of the things to worry about in space. To see more activities under Keep Space for Peace Week, the item there, or you can go to the Global Network. There are a few webinars coming up this week, which we hope will help people understand more about what's going on into space and why it's so important to oppose it. So thanks very much. I hope you got all that.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was incredibly interesting, informative, and very frightening, really. This must be the future, and part of our future. We've got many other things, but this is a new dimension. And thank you so much for illuminating that and giving us the threshold. Thank you so much. Could we now maybe ask Kate Hudson? Kate Hudson is the General Secretary of CND and a very experienced activist, great knowledge of things, and she will give us a wider strategic view of many things. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Nigel, and thanks to Dave as well, and to Paul for that fantastic video. Rob, can I just request that if my sound goes funny, tell me, and I'll switch my video off. That might make it a bit easier. And can I urge everyone to put your questions, if you want to ask questions to Dave or to me, do put them in the Q&A box or in the chat line, and then Dave or I will try and come back to them either during my little talk or afterwards. So thanks very much. So it's good to be here with you all today. I think we will all share the view that we live in increasingly dangerous times. There are so many different crises. It's unbelievable. We've got the pandemic now, which is exacerbating many other problems, the economic problems, attacks on civil and human rights, there's fake news, anti-science, the rise of the far right and racism. And then, of course, underpinning and overlaying all of that, we have the two existential threats of climate change and nuclear war. Of course, you'll know that they were identified again this year by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists as the key existential threats when they set the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight earlier this year. That's the closest they've ever been, closer even than during the Cold War. So neither climate change nor nuclear weapons are new problems. There have been campaigns against both for decades, but in the last few years, it seems that the dangers have certainly escalated. The situation has been made much worse by powerful global figures denying the problems and actively making them worse. And I would say that those who refuse to recognise and deal with climate change bear the responsibility for the unfolding climate catastrophe. And I'm sure as people see California or Australia on fire, burning literally, people will share that view. And of course, those who persist in producing nuclear weapons and lowering the barriers to use, I think that that's one of the key dangers now that we're facing, this lowering the barrier to the use of nuclear weapons. They're also responsible for the increasing danger of nuclear annihilation. And of course, linked to that, from our point of view as campaigners, there's the failure, because of the preoccupation with nuclear weapons and those forms of so-called defence, there's a failure to address other key security challenges like the pandemic. And again, when the pandemic was starting out, and it was hitting Britain and elsewhere in spring, it became instantly clear that this had been identified for many years, over a decade or more, as a tier 1 security challenge by successive British governments, but they'd cut funding to the NHS instead of investing more in dealing with such public health emergencies. At the same time, they were spending, let's say, 205 billion or more on new nuclear weapons. And we're seeing that across all the nuclear weapon states. It's not just Britain and Trident replacement, but of course, across other nuclear weapons states as well. So this kind of completely skewed priorities that we're facing. And I know that many of us are hoping that with the window of opportunity presented by new thinking and kind of new challenges and opportunities as a result of the pandemic, it may be possible to get a changed policies on some of these key so-called security areas. But one of the most worrying factors, I think, is the change in US nuclear policy, away from the idea that nuclear weapons should never actually be used. For decades, that was the stated view, as we've heard it many times from our own politicians. Oh, they'll never be used. We have them in order not to use them. They're there to put other people off, kind of so-called deterrence argument. That has kind of dropped down the US policy agenda. And now there's the idea of adopting usable nuclear weapons and supposedly small nuclear weapons, which are actually around the size of the Hiroshima bomb. And tragically, these aren't just ideas floated in some White House policy document. Since they appeared in Trump's nuclear strategy earlier in his presidency, they've actually been manufactured and now deployed. So these so-called usable nuclear weapons are with us. They're out there on the subs and so on. So very, very dangerous situation. So when it comes to Croughton, it may not be a nuclear base as such, but it is clearly a major hub for US military and clandestine communications, and it could relay the information that could lead to a nuclear confrontation. So Croughton is central to our work as CND, and I'm very keen that we should do more to really raise the profile of RAF USAF Croughton and what happens there and what we need to do about it. It's had a role in US nuclear strategies for a long time. In the depths of the Cold War, it relayed nuclear bomber communications, including with events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, so it's been there a long time doing these kinds of things, and I'm 100% wanting to really step up the challenge to this. So as we heard from Dave in his very interesting presentation, the increasing militarization of space is proceeding very fast, and it's alarming to hear that Trump may walk away from the Outer Space Treaty, although Dave was explaining to me a bit earlier that actually no one's taken that much notice of it anyway, but it's important to keep these treaties there on the table. And that goes along with Trump pulling away from a number of other treaties too. In fact, the last few years are littered with torn up agreements. The INF Treaty, the Iran nuclear deal, the Open Skies Treaty, and we don't know yet about the New START Treaty. Will it be renewed or not? But there's a big question mark over that, and that would be catastrophic if the New START Treaty wasn't renewed. And we're looking at a situation where there would be no restraints on nuclear weapons, no arms control or reduction treaties for such weaponry. But of course, pulling out of treaties isn't new, and it's not confined to Trump either. And I was thinking about this yesterday, actually. The crucial treaty when it comes to the development of missile defense and space warfighting was, of course, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which I noticed on one of Dave's final diagrams. You know, it said new ABM treaty. You know, that's what we need as part of the process of cutting back and ending the militarization of space. And I'm sure most of you would know about the ABM treaty, but for those of you who don't, it was signed in 1972 by the United States and the Soviet Union, and it banned almost all anti-ballistic missile systems. And it was developed because the signatories understood that ABM systems just meant more and bigger missiles backing up a first strike posture. That's what it came down to. And in fact, I remember CND having a very good campaign, unfortunately not successful, but very good campaign and clear about this in the late 1990s. And the treaty first came under threat in the 1980s with President Reagan's Star Wars initiative, so-called SDI, I think was its Strategic Defense Initiative, was the formal name. And he was trying to confront what he called the evil empire. Those of you who are the right age would remember that. Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan. And after he left office, the Star Wars research was cut back. But it was President Bush who finally pulled out of it in 2002. And that was the first time in recent history that the US pulled out of a major international arms treaty. And of course, as I said, we campaigned against it at the time. But of course, after September the 11th, 2001, this was all taking place in the middle of Bush's newly launched war on terror. And of course, the full horrors of the neocon project for a new American century. Remember that, anybody? I mean, we should revisit some of these things to understand what's going on now. But the end of the ABM treaty meant the setting up of the US Missile Defense Agency and the start of their aggressive program of expansion. So even though we weren't successful in stopping or saving the ABM treaty, we and the wider movement internationally as well were more successful in defeating Bush's plans for missile defense in Europe. And I think this is one of those things we need to just remember. He wanted to put various things in Poland and the Czech Republic. And there was a massive civil society campaign in the Czech Republic in particular, which we helped with and supported. And those were cancelled when Obama came into office. But then, as you all know, no doubt, he then pursued a more softly approach, and US NATO systems developed worldwide with their focus on Russia and China. And now we are where we are with that, and the US kind of orientation towards China as well as Russia is proceeding apace. And of course, now space is the new frontier. As Dave said, space forces are proliferating, and of course we still have an enormous amount of work to do. So I would just conclude, Nigel, by saying Keep Space for Peace Week has never been more important. I would like to thank all of you that are active on this, whether it's Croughton or Menwith Hill, Fylingdales, and all the bases, all the other bases where peace is being undermined. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Kate. That was remarkable. I think we are all going to have to do our own revisiting when this goes up onto the CND site. It's going to be recorded because there's so much information from you, so much information from Dave, and so much information from Paul. Wonderful stuff. It's brightened up the afternoon hearing you all. So thank you so much. There's now a question and answer session. So I wonder if you can see some of the questions that have come in or are coming in, and whether you're able to answer some of those. How does that work?
Dave can take a look. Don't forget, Dave, there was one about Elbit Systems as well that came in by email.
Yes.
Unmute.
Yes, Elbit Systems UK is a kind of a subsidiary of Elbit Systems Limited, which I think is an Israeli-based aerospace corporation, basically. So it's involved in all of the, the different projects you'd expect an aerospace corporation to be involved with. But in particular, it developed the drone that Israel uses or has used against Palestine and other places, or Palestine anyway, Palestinians. And the UK was going to model its drone called Watchkeeper, I think, from what I remember, based on this Elbit system. I don't know quite what happened to Watchkeeper. I think it wasn't quite successful. I know they flew some original flights from a base in Wales, airport in Wales, or an airfield in Wales, but I'm not sure whether that's carrying on being developed or not. I have to check on that one. Thanks. But they have divisions around the country. Elbit Systems UK has several. I think it employs around 500 people engaged in a range of different activities.
Mm. And Dave, in Q&A, there's a question I think you're best equipped to answer. Can you clarify the status of Croughton, Menwith Hill and Molesworth? Menwith Hill is formerly RAF Menwith Hill with an RAF commander. Does this apply to the other bases, formerly RAF but in practice US bases? Does the legality and accountability differ for these bases? Would you have a go at that one?
Okay. I think the legality and accountability doesn't differ. It's the same. And it comes under what was signed at the end of the Second World War in 1951, the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, and the Visiting Forces Act, which brought that into a legal status in the UK. So basically, it's something which is saying we are allowing the United States military, the Air Force in particular, to have bases in this country, specific bases in this country. Now, really, they should, they're not answerable to UK law. This case around Croughton signifies the importance of of why they should be able to answer to UK law. But in fact, wherever the US bases are around the world, not just in this country, but all over the world, you'll find injustices brought, carried out by US personnel on those bases are not brought to justice, basically. I think they may operate slightly differently. So, for example, the two bases I'm very much familiar with in Yorkshire, Menwith Hill and Fylingdales. Fylingdales is an RAF radar system, as I say, but it's partly, a lot of its functions are joint RAF and US military, USAF, but it only has one American military personnel on the base. There are some contractors, some corporate contractors, but only one military person from the US. Whereas in Menwith Hill, the case of Menwith Hill, it's kind of more the other way around. There's a lot of not so much military, but NSA, the National Security Agency personnel, and others to do with the satellite business, and also GCHQ, which is the equivalent UK equivalent of the NSA, working on the intelligence gathering there. And we very rarely see the American sort of commander of that base. We see a liaison officer who is a British RAF officer. They sometimes come out and speak to us when we're doing demonstrations, or when the local campaigning group is doing local demonstrations and so on. So I think it kind of varies from base to base, but although they should all come under this status of forces agreement between the UK and the US. I did mention Molesworth was due to close. There were 3 bases which were due to close just a few years ago. There were plans to cut down on the amount of money, I think, that the Americans were spending on these bases abroad. And those 3 were due to close. But now it looks like they're going to be expanded rather than closed. So some of the functions that were being planned for Croughton are now being shifted over to Molesworth, which looks like it's going to expand quite considerably. And although some of the personnel at Menwith Hill have actually been reduced, this may be due to either them being distributed in other places in the UK, or because many of the operations that are carried out there are now more automated and can be carried out from a distance. So they're not quite so much a requirement for the people to be on the base, although it's not quite clear.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. And you've just reminded me that on one of our protests up at Fylingdales, some very nice, very charming RAF chap came out in a nice light blue shirt and was very polite to us and took our letter of protest. So that was the RAF front man, I think.
These things do change, though. They went through a period where they were very, very chatty. They would talk to us a lot. Now they don't talk to us. So, you know.
All right. So we've just got a couple of final things before we go to Nigel to do the final musical part. So thanks to Hugh for that question. Sarah from Bicester, you asked, you had a point there about you've seen something on the A4095 called Whitehall Satellite Earth Station. Is that site part of this communications loop? There's an answer actually in the chat there from Chris, who says the Whitehall satellite dishes are UK civil telecommunications ones owned by Mercury. And then the final question before we go to Nigel. This is one for you as well, Dave, perhaps, from Toby. What rationale, if any, has been presented by the UK government for exempting Croughton from parts of the law?
Well, I don't think there is one. They're not really, they shouldn't be exempt from parts of the law, I think. What they claimed in the case of Harry Dunn was that the person who ran into him, the woman who ran into him and killed him on his motorbike, claimed diplomatic immunity. But, you know, and there is such a thing as diplomatic immunity, which is covered by the Status of Forces Act and also and so on. But in this case, she wasn't a diplomat. Her husband, who was working on the base, wasn't a diplomat either. Basically, he was a spy. So it was, you know, she was whisked away very quickly by the United States, which is what happens in these sort of cases. It doesn't mean at all that she was exempt from parts of the law. In fact, I think she has been, there was a trial, wasn't there? I believe somebody else might know more about this than me. And she was supposed to be called for trial for the accident, but of course she won't be there. And I think they were also, Britain called for her to be sent back from the United States to stand trial, but the US has refused to do that. So you know, things aren't operating as they should, but they're not, certainly she shouldn't have been exempt from the law.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think our time is up, really, for this. Nigel, are you there? And you can go to the musical finale.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's been such a lot spoken about today. We will have to sit back and go through it all again. There's such a lot of information, such a lot of facts there, all relating to our prime thing of anti-nuclear campaigning, but all of this is part of the same evil project, really. So we will sit back later and digest this. But in the meantime, we'll end with some music from the SeaGreen Singers, who are an Oxford-based campaigning singers group, and we'll have a slideshow from Paul Mobbs to go with it. Thank you so much, everybody. Rob, would you like to fire away the slideshow? Thank you.
We are the Oxford SeaGreen Singers, and we're still singing, singing for our lives. We are the Oxford SeaGreen Singers, and we're still singing, singing for our lives. We've sung 1,000 songs of peace, and we will sing 10,000 more. For how can we be silenced when the guns still roll? We've sung 1,000 songs of peace, and we will sing 10,000 more. For how can we be silenced when the guns still roll? We sung 1,000 songs of peace, and we will sing 10,000 more. When the guns still roll. We are all under the stars, and no matter how far we are apart, we are all under the stars.
The arms race is moving into space. US Space Command has publicly stated that it intends to control space in order to protect US interests. It is crucial that the movement to stop this new round in the arms race moves quickly ahead.
We are all under the stars. stars.
The Pentagon believes that future military success will depend on space capabilities. But there are obstacles to US space dominance. The Outer Space Treaty, which the US has signed, forbids weapons of mass destruction from being deployed in space.
We are all under the stars, and no matter how far we are apart, we are all under the stars.
Using current satellite technologies, the US is able to intercept communications from anywhere on Earth and is able to identify and target any supposed enemy that it wishes. Through this control, the US intends to dominate the Earth and beyond.
We are all under the stars, and no matter how far we are apart, we are all under the stars.
Bombs cannot dissolve hatred, but justice and love can overcome the machines of destruction. Before us today are set life and death. We choose life, that we and the world's children may live.
We are all under the stars, and no matter how far we are apart, we are all under the stars. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world. We shall go singing to the fashioning of a new world.
Thank you so much, everybody. Let's all keep up the good work. I feel inspired by those speakers. Thank you so much. Welcome to everybody, and look forward to seeing it again on YouTube and on the CND website. And we carry on. We'll keep up the good work, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Nigel. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Not today, anyway.